Hello, and thank you for choosing this session on making marking meaningful. By way of a brief introduction, my name's Adam Richards. I'm responsible for data assessment and feedback within the maths team here at Walsall Studio School in 6th. I also teach music, so I've got some experience in subjects with two very different pedagogical approaches and requirements. So the aims of this session came out of the DFE's 2014 consultation on workload that identified marking as the single biggest contributor to unsustainable workload. Now, this session is about finding ways to make the work you do around marking more impactful, more efficient, and hopefully we can improve outcomes without increasing workload and maybe even reducing it. Not all the strategies I discuss are going to be equally applicable to all subjects. My two subjects, maths and music, have very different marking requirements. However, the overarching theme should still be relevant no matter what subject you teach. Now, to start off with, I know we've all been there. At the end of the day, we've got a huge stack of books. We're meticulously checking each one, writing suggestions, corrections, adding in questions, identifying things students have done well and directing them towards their next steps on how to improve, writing comments, grading. Unfortunately, despite the good intentions behind this, the EEF's marking review in 2016 noted that the quality of existing evidence focusing on specifically written marking is quite low. They noted that there are some forms of marking, including acknowledgement marking, that are unlikely to enhance pupil progress, and that there are some practices that can actually reduce the impact your marking has. We're going to look at some of those later to consider avoiding those pitfalls. Now, I started planning for this CPD session with the question, what is the purpose of marking? Now, for me, fundamentally, marking is how we as teaching staff can make sure that our students can demonstrate the skills, knowledge and understanding they need to be successful in whatever it is they are currently attempting. So with that in mind, does the marking that you currently undertake seek to meet that objective? Are you more informed about your class after marking their work? And what are you doing with that information once you have it? If you aren't more informed, or you aren't doing anything differently once you have marked, how has that time spent helped you, and by extension helped your students? So we're going to start by looking at some different marking strategies, some different approaches to marking to consider, are any of these something that you could implement or you could look to cherry pick from to see if here's a way you can make your marking more efficient. Now, the first strategy I'm going to look at is a thing called messy mark books. This doesn't mean that we spend our time scribbling over students' work or that we're abandoning the standards we have for the presentation of student work. It looks at removing the marking from students' books and using a separate document to track how your class has performed on a specific piece of work. Staff members look through students' work and make comments or write initials against these key criteria: their successes, next steps, literacy and numeracy errors, notes on priority students, dirt planning, good to great, models for excellent, and any extra notes. We're going to look at each one of these sections in turn. So the first one being successes. We often find a lot of similar successes when we mark work. So rather than writing the same comment over and over again, making a note of some common successes to discuss with the whole class is a much more efficient use of your time. It's much quicker to say to a class as a whole, well done, you all did brilliantly on question 7, than it is to write well done 30 times in exercise books. Similarly, next steps is a space for key misconceptions, knowledge and skills gaps to be noted so that these can be addressed with a larger group of students. You could place student initials alongside each next step to help you direct students on what they should do next to make progress, or for you to provide a more bespoke intervention to those specific students. Literacy and numeracy errors can be easily addressed in the third section. For example, if students are regularly forgetting to capitalise the names of people or places. Again, this can be fed back to the class as a whole, or for you to provide targeted support to relevant students. There is a section for you to make notes about your priority students. So if you're specifically targeting students on that grade 3-4 boundary, or if you want to make sure that high priority attaining learners are sufficiently challenged, here is a space for you to make notes on the students that are your priority. This is a great way of making your marking more meaningful to you, because it gives an explicit reminder to check on those how particular students are progressing. The second half of the document is about being proactive in your planning and adaptation of lessons moving forward. The first section is DIRT planning. Now, DIRT is an acronym I'm going to be using a lot, and it stands for Dedicated Improvement and Reflection Time. The purpose of this section of the document is for you to come up with a plan on how you're going to tailor your next lesson to support students. In maths, for example, if during a weekly assessment a number of students have struggled with a particular question, increasing by a percentage, for example, I will use the DIRT area to plan how I will help those specific students with that specific area of need. I would, for example, briefly recap that topic before giving students some similar questions so they can immediately put into action what they've just relearned or remembered. Alternatively, I could need to take a step back and revisit some prior learning where a knowledge gap or misconception has prevented those students from being successful. The next section, Good to Great, is where you can find a piece of student work that you identify as being good, but also note the next steps they need to take to make it great. You can then plan how this can be turned into a modelled discussion with students during a DIRT lesson. With the work under a visualizer, you may want to add some tick marks to certain parts of their working, celebrating what this student has done well, as well as spark a discussion with students. Why have I put this tick here? As a class, you could discuss what could have been done to improve this piece of work, including any literacy or numeracy errors noted before. This discussion and reflection can be extremely useful because students get to hear the metacognitive processes at play as the work is being improved. It can also often help students to improve their own work by showcasing what metacognitive tools they could use to improve their own responses. The Models for Excellence section is another place where students' work can be celebrated, and you can make notes about what specifically you want to draw the class's attention to under the visualizer. This is very useful for a student to complete their own DIRT activity. Seeing the model for excellent and having heard the teacher discuss the metacognitive processes with the student and the class. This lets students know why this is successful and in turn encourages them to consider what improvements they need to make in their work and then to make those improvements. This really helps a teacher in a DIRT lesson to really pinpoint with students whether success criteria have been achieved and how they can improve their work to better meet those criteria in future. Here's what some of those metacognitive processes look like in the classroom.
Okay guys, so we're going to be having a look at Good to Great today, and Cole has done a really good piece of work and I want us to celebrate that. So we're going to start with 2 claps on 3. 1, 2, 3. Thank you, Cole, for a really, really good effort with this today. So we're going to start off up in the title and looking for any literacy issues we might see. Take a moment to think. Everyone thinking? No hands up. Okay, Tyrone, what can you spot in that title?
Is it the T and the E and the N?
Oh, fantastic. Should be capital, so Cole, just something for you to work on there. Now, as we move into this first paragraph, I've put a tick almost straight away where it says, as a philosophy graduate, Rumans. What is the reason for that tick? Why have I put that there? Everyone thinking? Okay, Fatima, will you have a go for me?
I think it's referred to context.
Fantastic. So that clear link to context is a great start. Could you all jot that down in your books, please, guys, to remember those contextual links? Good work, Cole, on remembering to do that. So as a philosophy graduate, Rumans was interested in the concept I've put, we'll come back to that, of cultural displacement. She explored this by creating a persona of an emigree from a war-torn country. I've just circled that there because that semicolon should be a comma, which Cole's going to correct for me, who is struggling to come to terms with the fact that her country is not how it used to be. Moving down a bit now. Rumans begins the poem by creating an opening which imitates the style of a fairy tale, potentially trying to convey a sense of innocence. Now, I've ticked that potentially because it's that tentative language, that exploratory language, rather than stating things as fact, or projecting to the reader that the poem is written in a way that sounds like it's being told through memory. So there's some great ideas throughout there. In this first paragraph, I've put a tick here. Can anyone tell me what it was at this point of his response that earned him that tick? Okay, Cynthia, have a go for me. Fantastic. He has got that clear link to the question there. Can we all jot that down as a reminder in that opening paragraph? We need to be explicitly linking to the question, not just hinting at it, making that very direct link to the question and what the poem is about. So that's also exploring the main ideas of the poem. So I'll just give you a moment to do those reminders ready for when you do your own dirt work. Thank you, guys. Now, as ever, we did say it's good, and it is good, but want to make it great. So the thing that Cole needs to work on, you'll see I've done some highlighting here, is around his word selection. Sometimes the words he's selecting are not the correct word for the sentence. So you'll notice he wrote aspect. I corrected that to concept. And he wrote reflects. I changed that to imitates. So as Cole moves forward today, he's going to be really interrogating his choice of words as he writes to make sure that his written expression is sophisticated as it should be. Okay, guys, we're now going to open our books and have a look at our own first paragraph. So you could do that now. We're going to get ready to use what we've learnt from Cole to apply it to our own work.
This approach makes marking a more forward-looking process. We're looking at how we can improve on what has come before rather than simply make a judgment about how successful it was. This approach does have some downsides. Firstly, it's important that time is dedicated to these DIRT discussions and tasks, so students can use those metacognitive processes and think hard about what they need to do. Secondly, it requires explicit instruction to students that their work is being marked, even if their book isn't filled with red pen. If you're signposting students to relevant DIRT tasks for improvement, it should be obvious to them that you've looked at and considered their work and the ways they can improve it. Thirdly, book scrutinies or reviews from subject leaders or senior leaders may have to be conducted in a different way since you're marking in a different way. However, it should be clear from the improvement in student work over time that you're providing high quality feedback and insights for students. Now, I'm sure that some of you are watching this and thinking to yourself at this point, there's no way I'd be allowed to completely change how I mark students' work. I appreciate that sweeping whole-scale change like that may not be possible in your current situation. So let's look at what could be considered a middle ground between the traditional marking that some senior leaders expect to see and the benefits of this messy marking approach. This is one of the methods of assessment marking we use in the maths department at Studio School in 6th. Now, whole class feedback is similar to the messy marking approach, except it has the added benefit of there being evidence of marking in students' books. Now, whole class feedback revolves around a very simple pro forma that is completed after students have undertaken a piece of work. So here's an example from a Year 9 English lesson. The first section they have is an area for successes or excellent answers. This is to share with students what a model answer written by a student looks like. This, like the work in the messy mark books, can be used as a jumping off point for metacognitive discussions around what makes this an excellent answer, and for students to identify what they can do to improve their answer. Next to it, there are next steps and common misconceptions. These are given quite generally for students to identify what their next step should be based on their work, or to identify and correct any misconceptions. Next, there's an area for missing work, where you can monitor students who are not completing work or plan to provide intervention for absent students. And there is a section looking specifically at spelling, punctuation, grammar, along with general comments on the presentation of work. This section obviously is less applicable in some subjects compared to others, but you can of course tailor any form like this to suit your subject's needs. Finally, underneath, there's a section for providing DIRT activities. These are the activities that you are going to give to your class to guide them to making their improvements. At Studio School in 6th, the design of our assessment process and feedback sheet is based on Dylan Williams' 3 fundamental principles that underline effective feedback. Preparing for feedback by setting tasks that elicit useful information about attainment, providing well-timed feedback that focuses on moving learning forward, and considering what students do with their feedback. Now, we give students whole class feedback after our weekly low-stakes assessments. Students self-mark their assessment for an immediate idea of how successful they have been. One of our key philosophies is that there is no point in a student leaving the classroom unsure of how successful they were in that lesson. Then after the lesson, when teachers take in the tests for data monitoring, we check them over and complete our whole class feedback form. Now, our assessments are based on the last 3 weeks worth of content, so this is a good measure of not just attainment but also retention, as we're not just testing a skill once, it is repeatedly checked over a few weeks. This achieves our first bullet point of Dillon-Williams. Next, because we are giving our assessments weekly, along with feedback weekly, the aim of improving student outcomes in subsequent tests hits our second bullet point of Dillon-Williams, and the third bullet point is where we as teachers can have the most impact, considering what students do with the feedback. This is where the all-important DIRT activities come in. Our whole class feedback form is slightly different to the one I showed a minute ago. Firstly, our box for successes is much smaller, not because there are fewer successes to be found, but because students have already self-marked their work, so they know the areas they've done well in and what their good answers look like. However, it is still worth celebrating student successes. We also include a section for common misconceptions, but rather than focusing on spelling, punctuation, grammar, and presentation, we have a section that signposts keywords relevant to the area they've been looking at. This can be either for a discussion topic or for some basic retrieval practice. What does this word mean? Next, we have our area for our DIRT tasks underneath, just as before. The main difference we have is that rather than include a list of absent students on the sheet, we specifically assign DIRT tasks to students based on their particular area of need. Now, these DIRT tasks are just an example. They are not exhaustive. They should get gradually and progressively more challenging so that students are comfortable with some easier questions to begin with, but they increase in challenge as they progress through this activity. If a student wishes to do more than one DIRT task, they are of course more than welcome to. And if a student is fortunate enough to score close to 100% on an assessment, we use the DIRT time as an opportunity to provide some stretch and challenge questions. So in maths, it could be a worded problem-solving type question, or we can give students the chance to try and self-discover how to tackle a more difficult topic that is built upon the work they've just proven successful at. So, for example, if a student has become successful at increasing or decreasing by a percentage, we could give them a reverse percentages question to see if a student can find a way to arrive at the correct solution and approach on their own. Our whole class feedback form is used as a starting point for triple impact marking. Triple impact marking means that student work is marked, they respond, and then that response is marked again. Now, research shows that triple impact marking does have some promise, but the EAF marking review says there isn't yet the research base to draw any definitive conclusions or to see if any resultant benefits justify the time required for this triple impact marking. Our approach of using whole class feedback as our initial stage of marking greatly reduces the workload required for this triple impact marking. It takes me less than an hour each week to write a whole class feedback and mark student responses for 30 GCSE maths students. In our DIRT lessons, we recap the topics that students have not been fully successful at before students know what topic and task they have been assigned. This is so that they're fully engaged with the recap. They are then given a whole class feedback sheet as an A5 piece of purple paper, which is stuck at the top of a new page. It's purple to make it easy to identify in their exercise books where this marking and feedback has taken place. Students then complete their assigned DIRT activity underneath that glued-in sheet in order for them to put into practice what they've just learned in the recap. Those DIRT tasks are then marked by a teacher at a later stage and some comments are written. These comments are specific to the individual student and address any misconceptions that persist or identify errors and mistakes. I also make a note of any students who are still struggling after DIRT tasks so that I can plan an intervention in a future lesson. So this diagram kind of shows the rationale behind our low stakes assessment marking. So we start with our overarching look at the class as a whole in our whole class feedback. We then narrow that scope by giving students specific activities that they should work on to improve, and then further drilling down to a finer point by looking at individual student responses and improvements. Now, this approach seems to strike the best balance between delivering high quality feedback with students thinking carefully about improvements whilst not being too onerous on teachers' time and not significantly adding to workload. Once you're used to the whole class feedback model, completing the pro forma takes very little time. I spend more time devising dirt tasks than I do completing the rest of the form. A way of making further efficiency gains is a strategy Andrew Tharby, the author of Making Every Lesson Count, called the 5-minute flick. Rather than look at all students for whole class feedback, you could look at a sample of your class, say 5 or 6 students, and assess how students from a range of abilities performed in that lesson. Can then select one of those pieces of work as an example to critique as a class. Again, this relies on well thought out directed conversation with students given time to reflect and edit their own work independently. This has the obvious workload upside of taking less time to review students' work, but as with anything, the smaller the sample size, the less accurate the results. We chose not to take this approach in the maths team at Studio School in 6th because we are fortunate enough to have small enough classes that reviewing a whole class's work is a manageable workload. Now, let's look at something completely different. We're going to look at comparative judgment. This can be particularly powerful in creative areas, such as performances in music or creative writing in English. The concept itself is pretty easy to understand. Humans are, by nature, not great at making absolute judgments. The easiest example to think about is if somebody walks through the door into your classroom, how accurately could you judge their height? However, if 2 people walk through the door and you asked who is taller, suddenly that becomes a much more straightforward judgment to make and ends up being more accurate. There are 2 main ways of doing this within a subject. The first would be to mark against a mark scheme as you normally would, and then use a sample of work to comparatively judge. For example, if I have some GCSE music compositions that I've marked as being worth 19 and 20 marks, I should listen to them and compare which is better. Did the better response score the higher marks? The other approach would be the exact reverse of that. Rank order students from best to worst, and then use the mark scheme to assign marks to that work in ascending or descending order. Now, I personally prefer to assign marks in ascending order because you're looking to mark positively, giving as many marks as possible, rather than starting at 100% and deducting marks. There are a number of third-party platforms and solutions that offer comparative judgment tools, RM Compare and No More Marking. There are a couple of examples. No More Marking works by setting an assessment question nationally, and responses from across the country are combined and compared alongside each other. Now, this has the benefit of providing a breadth of experience to the marking process and allows more comparisons to be made, making it a more accurate assessment method. However, there is an associated cost with these services. The extra administration required to get No More Marking working properly could increase workload for some staff. Students' work needs to be written on specially barcoded paper, scanned in and reviewed by teachers. Furthermore, the nationally set questions mean that teachers have less flexibility and control over their assessments. And there's also a financial cost to these online comparative platforms. So while it may not be practical to invest in a separate marking platform, there could be ways you could use the same principle within your subject. One of the most well-known alternatives to traditional marking is live marking, where instead of checking students' work at the end of a lesson, you are checking on students' progress during the lesson. Now, teachers of practical subjects will have been doing this for years. There's no point in a PE teacher waiting until the end of a lesson to write in a book that a student's bowling technique in cricket isn't right. Immediately giving students feedback to work on is integral to the way practical subjects are taught, so why not do the same thing in more traditionally academic subjects? Again, there are 2 ways in which teachers often approach live marking. The author Richard James Rogers calls them diffusive live marking and absorptive live marking. Diffusive live marking is the idea of setting a task for students to complete, a worksheet, an exam question, a page in a textbook, and then once a few minutes have passed, you diffuse through the classroom, walking around, marking pen in hand, mark the students' work that they are doing in real time. You can add some written comments in the books alongside some verbal feedback, and you've just saved yourself some time after school. Even if you don't manage to make it around your entire class in one lesson, you can probably manage it over 2. Or you could do after-school marking only on those students you didn't see during the lesson. When I was teaching more classes, each one larger and less often, I would print a seating plan off each week and mark it off when I live marked a student's work. but I also keep a track of students who are repeatedly engaging in low-level disruption that never quite reached that threshold to be formally sanctioned. This helped me keep a track of who I had and hadn't marked between lessons, but also gave me the opportunity to specifically target any particular group of students because I had my seating plan with data there in front of me. I could, for example, go and see students who have got particularly high target grades, pupil premium or SEND students. The second approach is called absorptive live marking, and it begins in a similar fashion with students set a task to complete, but rather than you travelling to students, the teacher acts like a sponge that absorbs the students. They're called one at a time to bring their work up to you for you to live mark. Each of these approaches has pros and cons. Diffusive live marking acts as a useful behaviour management tool. Pockets of low-level disruption tend to respond to a teacher's proximity. However, it can be quite difficult to stand behind to the side of a student and mark their work on a crowded desk. Also means that if you need to have difficult conversations, they're a little bit harder to have. You could alter your classroom to make this more manageable. However, that might not be possible in all instances. Now, absorptive live marking has the benefit of being able to give more detailed and personal feedback because you have a dedicated space to do that, but it does lose that behaviour management upside. At this point, I want to pivot to thinking more generally about the marking that you do. Not necessarily suggesting new strategies, but encouraging you to reflect on your own practice and if it is as efficient and effective as it could be. So the first one that I'd like you to think about is, what does your marking look like? Now, I don't mean whether you should or shouldn't mark in red, or should students be responding to marking with a particular colour of pen, but are you being efficient and effective in your marking? Does every piece of work need to be marked in detail? If students are completing retrieval practice questions that are either right or wrong, does it need to be a teacher that looks at those, or could students mark their own work? A way of encouraging students to mark their own work is called RAG 123. This is where students or teachers can RAG rate the student's effort in lesson, and you assign a 1, 2 or 3 based on students' understanding on that particular topic or piece of work. That's a great way of engaging students in their learning. So for example, you could get students to self-assess at the end of each lesson, and then you as a teacher review their rating. You can, for example, as you can see here, either make comments in the book if you disagree with them. There's always going to be that one student who hasn't written a thing all lesson but rates themselves as green for effort. But alternatively, you could just make a note of the students that rate their understanding as being low and prepare an intervention for the next lesson. Or if there are many students struggling, you could prepare to recap prior learning to support those students. It can take between 5 to 50 minutes to review a whole class's work, so you could do this much more regularly, although it does obviously involve training students to be honest about their effort and understanding. If you are regularly writing the same comments in students' book, Amjad Ali created some stickers that look like plasters to put on his students' work. It's to show that this is an easy to fix common mistake. He's made a number of them for different subjects, so if you search for his Try This Teaching website, you'll be able to find some of them there. But it's a great way of saving you the time of having to write the same comment over and over again, and because it's quite colourful, draw students to actually look at and read your comments and feedback. You could consider, for some peer assessment, displaying the mark scheme that you would use for a task or the lesson success criteria, and ask students to peer assess. Now, Ron Berger's book An Ethic of Excellence suggests an approach called gallery critique, where students circulate around the room like an art gallery, giving feedback. They are explicitly shown to follow the mantra of kind, specific and helpful. So what they write must fit those 3 criteria. They place it on a post-it note and place it on or next to the work. Now, not only do students receive lots of high-quality feedback from a number of peers, but they also learn from looking at the work of others. You can then ask students to summarise the feedback given by their peers and write some targets for future lessons. Even if you chose a more static way of peer assessing work, swapping books with the person they're sat with, and assign them a grade from the displayed mark scheme, you could carve out some of this peer assessment time to question students about why they are giving that particular mark, grade level, whatever it is. It can bring in some of those good metacognitive conversations and processes without adding to your workload. You could even get parents to mark. Give students the mark scheme with a homework task and allow parents to mark it. Now, parents or carers can sometimes be harsher or stricter in their marking than you would be. I know that I've invented half marks for students who did something mathematically sensible but didn't see through to get anything from the mark scheme. It will also help encourage parents to get involved with their child's learning. Now, this will obviously work better with some group of students to others, depending on parental engagement, but it allows students to know at home whether they're being successful with homework, and if they aren't, they can either get help from a parent or carer or come to teaching staff in lessons for support. A negative issue around marking can be the awarding of grades. Do we put some sort of measure of performance alongside these formative comments? Now, whilst a grade or a score is a way to quantify how well a student has understood a concept, a study from King's College London found that both high and low attaining students were less likely to act on feedback if grades were awarded alongside comments. I think of it like a menu in a restaurant. Before I look at the food options, I'm looking at the prices. And if I'm disappointed, I won't bother reading the rest of the menu in any sort of depth or at all. If we're looking for students to engage with the comments that we make, it may be beneficial to not present them alongside a score or grade. Mealcop's Research School in Southport developed an approach for this called flash marking, which stands for Fast, Logical, Aspirational Student Help. This is where teachers give skills-based feedback to students rather than grades. Now, they initially trialled this with Key Stage 4 English, where the skills required to access the top band of GCSE English and English literature performances are translated into short codes that teachers can use while marking. These codes are also used in lessons to teach the students the skills and for teachers to track the strengths and weaknesses across their classes. Students are also encouraged to use these same codes in self and peer assessment to make it faster, focused and more useful. Unfortunately, the EAF did not manage to complete this trial due to the pandemic, but the implementation and process evaluations showed that it was viewed largely positively by teachers, who found the training they did helpful and that it reduced their marking workload. And while the student results could not be accurately measured as a result of exams being cancelled, those teachers who responded believed it did benefit students. It is, however, equally important that students do not underestimate their potential and are aware of their current level of performance. It may be worth considering alternative ways of expressing students' progress that avoids grades, or by finding the right balance of giving students grades and comments. The EAF Marking Review says that several studies looking at the impact of marking quickly found that next lesson feedback had a positive outcome on students' progress compared to slower feedback. That would make sense considering the impact that verbal feedback has on students. However, those studies only looked at English as a foreign language, and the size of that impact has not yet been estimated. That being said, it must surely be worth considering how we balance the speed and frequency and depth of marking. There's also considerations you can make around what support you're giving a student in your marking. If a student has written a paragraph and on 3 occasions incorrectly used an apostrophe, that might be an indication there's a fundamental misconception at work. Whereas if within the work there is just a single instance of, for example, not capitalizing a name, but throughout the rest of the work they've done so correctly, these will need different comments or potentially none at all. The repeated error probably needs some addressing, a comment, a dirt task, something. However, a simple mistake could just be marked as incorrect without any elaboration. And you can encourage students to self-identify the mistake and self-correct it. That's yet more valuable metacognition at work. Now, I talked earlier about the research school that used codes for their feedback. Research shows that coded feedback, like writing SP for a spelling mistake, speeds up your marking and is just as effective as writing out some uncoded feedback, providing students understand what the codes mean. That doesn't mean it has to be a prescribed list of codes used school or department wide. You could add some codes to student pieces of work and then display what those codes mean for students to copy into their books. I hope you found this session useful. Please get in touch if you'd like me to share any of the resources I've shown with you. But to summarise, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to marking, like all aspects of teaching realistically. Good teachers are those who adapt what they are doing to their individual approach and the students they teach. Now, hopefully, you found a marking approach that you could maybe employ within your school, or had a particular question answered, or at the very least, had something to think about. Marking and feedback is one of those inevitabilities of teaching, but just because it's inevitable doesn't mean it is immovable. Marking doesn't have to involve hours after school with a red pen. It can be sitting next to a student showing how to make corrections and improvements, or having high quality discussions about what makes good work good. We need to move away from that old joke. School is a place where children go to watch teachers work. Teachers don't make learning happen, learners make learning happen. So in my opinion, we need to include learners much more in the marking and feedback process. As Dylan William puts it, the only thing that matters with feedback is what students do with it. Thank you for watching.